Welcome, everybody. This is Allison Brown. I'm one of the co-presidents of League of Women Voters Falls Church, and Wendy Freeman, who is our other co-president. The two of us welcome you to this talk today. We're very glad to have Delegate Marcus Simon join us, and he's going to give us some of his time to share some of the really exciting and new things that the legislature is doing and has done this year. And we'll also be happy to take questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat function. So just a couple things before we get started. If you're not a member of League of Women Voters Falls Church, please put your name and email address in the chat function so we know who's attending. And we are recording this session. And the last thing is also want to mention that we have another forum coming up September 13th. Councilwoman Letty Hardy will be joining us, and we'll be able to have a conversation with Letty about all things Falls Church. So please put September 13th forum on your calendar as well. So now I'm happy to introduce Delegate Marcus Simon, and we are going to kick off with actually some new news in terms of what's going on right now in Richmond. The General Assembly is engaged in a special session. So I'd like to hear from Marcus about what's going on in the special session. What are the top priorities? What do you think will get done this month?
So Allison, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, giving me the opportunity to do this and publicizing it. I keep getting Google alerts because every time my name comes up in your event being advertised in the news press, I get a little alert that I've done something worthy. So thank you guys for giving me this chance to do this. And it's a great group of folks. One of the kind of, it's easy to get down and in the dumps, I think, about COVID and about the fact that it seems to be going on and on and on and the way it's disrupted our lives. But I do try and look for some positives. And so if you all can see my background, I mean, one of the nice things is I get together and do this forum, and I'm taking a short break from being out on the water. I don't know if you all can tell or not, but I'm out at Pohick Bay Regional Park here in Fairfax County with my kids. We were just water skiing earlier. I'm taking a break to see you all, and they're out playing around on the wave runner. So, look for the bright spots and the silver linings where you can. I get to do forums like this virtually. And speaking of doing things virtually, that's been one of the, so far on the House side, that's been sort of the biggest topic that we've had to deal with as part of the special session. Chernell Herring and I introduced a rules change at the beginning of the session to allow our committees to do their work and to do votes virtually. We've had work groups and committees and commissions virtually for several months now. But they haven't been able to take votes, at least on the House side, because we have a House rule that prevents people who are participating electronically from being counted towards a quorum. So we've got a rules change that sort of clarifies that in this day and age of COVID and virtual work and Zoom and WebEx and other types of virtual presence, that you can be present for a session virtually and still count as part of a quorum. The Republicans sort of towing, I had to be partisan here, I know it's a nonpartisan group, but it's just the fact that the Republican caucus in the House, taking their cues, I think, from the administration, anti-virtual, and so they're making us through the lengthy process of five days of meetings and readings before we can change the rule and get to work. So we'll really get to that. That's the procedural process piece of it. When we get to work on Monday, our committees will start to meet. I'm on the General Laws Committee, and we'll meet and we'll discuss an eviction moratorium. So we've got language bills in to start to provide some eviction relief for people that are in danger of losing their homes because of the COVID crisis and the economic disruption that's caused. We've got a bill to declare Juneteenth a holiday. That has nothing to do with COVID. That has much more to do with the current civil rights, new civil rights movement that's going on, a recognition that Black Lives Matter and of the important role that African Americans have played in Virginia's history, and so we're going to honor that. That'll be a ceremonial thing. And then we also have some substantive changes in criminal justice in particular that we'll be tackling when Public Safety and Courts of Justice committees meet. I'm on the Courts Committee. I'm carrying a bill, for instance, to make it easier to decertify police officers who have resigned or been fired for misconduct. Sometimes they avoid criminal charges or avoid formal discipline by resigning. In fact, many police officers in the past have used that. They resign from the, say, of Falls Church Police, for instance, and then go take a job in Fairfax County. because they're still certified, or they go to work in Loudoun, or they go to work down in Virginia Beach. And so we're going to make it easier, for the folks to say, well, it's just a few bad apples, whether you believe that or not. I think that even the police chiefs and even the State Police Association says we ought to make it easier to get rid of the folks that everybody agrees are bad apples and don't belong in the police force. So I've got a bill to do that. We've also got bills in the House side that will remove sovereign immunity for police officers, or start to erode that so that they can be held personally accountable when they violate people's civil rights in the line of duty. We've got bills to ban chokeholds, to prohibit no-knock warrants unless they're issued by a judge. So that sort of raises the threshold for no-knock warrants. A whole host of reforms like that. And I'm happy if you guys have questions about specific items, but that's sort of the substantive piece. And then we also have budget. I mean, that's the main reason we were called back. Somebody's car alarm is going off in the background. Hope you guys don't hear that. But the main reason we're back was because we knew that we were going to have to redo the budget in light of all the shutdowns related to COVID-19. And so we're going to have to do some work on we got a new forecast of revenue. We're having a debate right now about how deep do we want to dig into the rainy day fund. Is this the rainy day? Or is there a rainier day ahead? We want to continue to save for that. And so those discussions will be playing out over the next probably about 2 weeks or so. And then I'll stop talking in a minute. I promised I wouldn't filibuster, and here I am. But of particular interest, I think, to the league and league folks, we have a bill that should drop on Monday that is specific to voting, and particularly voting in the 2020 election. It's a revenue bill. It helps us spend CARES Act money that we have been given for the purpose of securing the election and conducting the election safely. And so along with that money, there's some language changes and some text changes to the way we do voting in Virginia for 2020 that will make it easier. It goes along with some things we did during the regular session, but it's going to make it easier to vote absentee or vote early. What do you call it, absentee? Or absentee in person or absentee by mail. So for instance, we're going to have language in there that makes it really clear that localities can establish drop box locations at any place where you do polling. So that can be in Fairfax County, we have satellite voting centers for early voting. I think we have 16 this year. Every one of those can have a drop box put in front of it, but also it allows for a drop box to be at every polling place on election day. Now, not every locality is going to take advantage of that or has the resources to take advantage of that, but we wanted to give everybody the option. Because I know that there's a huge number of people that have applied for absentee ballots already because they're worried about the mail, getting them to them on time. And I suspect that some folks may not feel real comfortable putting that ballot back in the U.S. mail to get back to be counted. And so they want an alternative way once their ballot is to them and filled out to return it without having to overwhelm David Bjerke and his folks by all lining up and walking into the registrar's office. So those are sort of the highlights. The big things we'll do is, again, through the budget and through an appropriations act, we're going to make voting easier with drop boxes. We have a cure period. We're going to allow an opportunity for people who have defective ballots to cure them. So registrars will have to call and let you know, hey, there's a problem. You forgot to include your middle initial. You forgot to sign the outside envelope. Do you want to try and get in here and fix that? We're allowing ballots to arrive for up to 3 days after the election date if they were sent before the election. We're going to have drop boxes everywhere. I think those are the big pieces of the changes that we've made. We're allowing registrars and the boards of election to start tallying absentee ballots early so that the most that come in early, they can be tallied, even though the results won't be released until 7 o'clock, so that we don't have wild swings in the results. Since I think somebody told me they estimate about 2/3 of Falls Church City voters, for instance, may vote early in some way, shape, or form. You could have a big difference in the results once the absentee ballot precincts are reported. So we'll try and address that by having those ballots ready to go and at least a big chunk of them ready to announce on election night. So with that, I'll stop for a second.
Yeah, how likely do you think it is that the Dropbox provisions and other provisions will be passed and signed into law and, in time to impact this election?
Well, so we kind of pulled that out to its own appropriations bill. Usually we would have done all that in a big new bill, which would be the new budget essentially. we'll pull that out. We're doing that on its own because we need to fast track it because a lot of this enabling legislation, the state create some regulations to implement some of these new authorities, and they need to get to work on that as quickly as possible because people are going to start returning their ballots September 18th. You can start to vote. So the election really starts in about 3 weeks. So the goal is to get all that done next week, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think if not, then certainly by the first week of September, before Labor Day. And I think it's very likely it'll pass. I mean, there may be some tweaks. You know, the courts just approved a consent order between the League of Women Voters and Mark Caring's office and the ACLU to say that a missing witness signature during the state of emergency, when we're all supposed to be staying away from each other, will not be a fatal defect with absentee ballots. We have language like that in the budget. That language may or may not pass now that we have the court decision to support that particular issue. So there may be some fine tuning that happens, but I think that by and large it's going to pass. And again, a lot of it is just creating authority, optional authority. And so, you know, not every locality is going to be able to implement all of these things, but we want to make sure that you have there's no legal impediments to doing everything possible to make sure every vote gets counted.
Right. Okay. Really good to know, and good to have a sense of the timing, because for those of us doing voter education, we have to keep updating our materials. So we won't print too many. We'll keep our electronic stuff up to date, and you know, just print them in small batches. So waiting.
I'm happy to send you copies of the bill once it drops. We've got some text. I'll send it out, and I'll let you know. I'll keep you updated on the iterations as it gets amended.
Great. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the General Assembly also did a lot in the earlier session this year in January, February. And maybe you can give us some highlights from that session, things that changed in Virginia this year based on what this year's General Assembly did.
You know, it's as we were talking about earlier before I think everybody jumped on the call, it was really a historic year. And it's sort of a shame in some ways that it's been overshadowed for a variety of reasons. But, you know, we had about maybe a week or so to kind of pat ourselves on the back before the news all really shifted to COVID and the pandemic response. But we accomplished some pretty remarkable things. So the first thing to remember, I'm sure you all on this call probably already know this, but I never assume anything. But the General Assembly had been dominated by Republican majorities really since 2000. So for 20 years, really 22, but 20 years since we've had a Democratic majority. And all of a sudden we have one in both the House and the Senate, and a Democrat in the governor's branch. So we had a pretty ambitious agenda, and a huge number of the things that we were trying to do actually passed. Things like raising the minimum wage. We have a minimum wage bill that's going to gradually take our minimum wage in Virginia to $15 an hour. I put it to do that a few years ago, and it was sort of a starting point for discussion just to get people thinking about the minimum wage. I didn't expect it would happen anytime soon, and it's happening. So we're raising the minimum wage. We passed the bill I talked about to make voting easier. We eliminated the onerous photo ID requirement and created more options for people to prove their identity at the polls, including, if you have to, signing an affidavit. Got rid of some of the requirements that the ID has to be current. So if you have a driver's license that's just expired or recently expired, that won't be an impediment to you voting. We allowed localities to enter into collective bargaining agreements with their public sector employees, and it's permissive. Doesn't require it, but you know, if you have progressive counties with strong municipal unions that want to collectively bargain and have larger contracts, they can do that now because of legislation that was passed in the 2020 session. We really, you know, a couple of years ago, we expanded Medicaid in Virginia. This year, actually just this week, we finally stood up our state exchange under Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. So we're going to have more options for people to purchase insurance on the exchange, more control over our own Virginia exchange. It was just approved by the feds, I think, yesterday. So, you know, more healthcare, less expensive healthcare options. We decriminalized marijuana. I start going through my litany of things that we did, and I almost forget that we decriminalized marijuana, which in any other session would have been, you know, the top of the fold headline. And that was part of the beginning of some criminal justice reforms I think we're going to continue this year. One of the ones that will continue this special session I didn't mention earlier is getting rid of pretextual stops. We found that one of the things that happens, one of the ways that you create these interactions between people of color and the police so often is that police are able to make up, police officers will tell you, if I can't come up with a reason to stop you, I'm not smart enough to be a police officer. And whether it's there's a tag dangling from your mirror, your tint looks like it might be too dark. And then even if it's not, they use that as a pretext to stop the cars and search and do other things. So we're going to start to eliminate that. And also, I think, get rid of although the marijuana is still a illegal, we're getting rid of it as a pretext for searches of vehicles and so forth. So those are some of the big highlights. I'm sure I'm forgetting some other very significant things that we did. Oh, we created a student loan borrower bill of rights. This is a bill I've been working on for 5 years to regulate student loan servicing companies in Virginia, who are really the second largest source of debt in the state, second only to mortgage debt. Mortgage is very heavily regulated. There's very little regulation of student loan debt, and the feds have really sort of abandoned any kind of enforcement. Enforcement is down 85% in the last 3 years, if you can imagine what happened in the last 3 years. So we now have options for student loan borrowers to seek enforcement through the State Corporation Commission and through private suits. So if Navient forgets to tell you that you're supposed to be in a public sector loan forgiveness program, or has you enter into a forbearance and doesn't tell you that interest continues to accrue when in fact you qualified to have some of that debt forgiven, you have recourse against them, and they have to tell you the truth and give you accurate information about your options. We legalized sports gambling in Virginia. Again, any other session that probably would have been a big deal. Although, now that we finally have sports back, I suppose. But the Virginia Lottery is developing an app now. They expect to have that available next September, trying to bring some of what we know has been going on illegally into the legal market and the regulated market in Virginia. Also some revenue for the state lottery funds, and an app that protects consumers. My contribution to that was to insist that it include a sports bettors bill of rights, which has certain requirements for transparency, allows people to self-exclude or put limits on themselves when betting. Again, transparency requirements, prevents insider betting, requires that they use good real-time data for I think it's called prop bets. But if there's a time delay on the broadcast, believe it or not, gamblers can take advantage of that. So we have built-in things to help fix issues like that to keep it consumer friendly. So those are some of the things that we did. They're maybe a little more consequential. So I'm happy, again, if you guys have heard about other things you want me to talk about and expand, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, definitely a lot that happened. And we actually have a few questions that really go back to voting for this election.
Sure.
And one of them came up because of a news report that in Merrifield, the post office had started taking away some mail sorters. So we're wondering if you have heard about that, if they're, what you know about that, and if that's a concern.
So I did. I've heard the news accounts of that. I have not talked to Congressman Byers' office or Congressman Connolly's to find out what more they know about that. It's all fairly recent developments. But that is what's sort of motivating us to create more alternatives for people to return their ballots other than the mail. I mean, we can jump up and down and pound our fists. We can make them stop. But, I've heard, you're hearing stories like from Oregon where the postal workers sort of had to refuse to disassemble the sorting machines to get them to stop. So, I am concerned. I think we all, concerned is probably a little bit of an understatement. I don't want to be dramatic about it, but, clearly there's a concern on the part of the administration that they can't win if every vote gets counted. And they're going to couch that as a fear of fraud. I think the best thing we can do at the state level is to make it really, really easy for people to return their ballots, to vote early, and also help do some voter education like you guys are doing on different options that you have if you've already requested an absentee ballot. I think it's what I worry about a little bit on election day is I suspect some people went ahead and figured it doesn't hurt to request an absentee ballot, not understanding that once you've done that, it makes it a little more complicated to vote on election day. If we have huge numbers of people just saying, you know what, I'm putting on my mask, I'm gonna get in line and I'll do it, that can be a 5 or 10 minute process to deal with the fact that you took a ballot. You need to spoil that ballot and issue a new ballot and go vote it and so forth. So to try and avoid that, again, having the option to use the polling place as a drop box location or a drop off location, I think will help with a lot of those problems. So yeah, I share everybody's concern about the mail. And that's the other, one of the counterintuitive things that my good friend Kate Hanley in Fairfax has recommended we do, and I think we did, was we actually pushed, we shortened the period of time in which you can ask for your absentee ballot to be mailed to you. It's not really voter suppression. We just don't want people asking a week before the election for their ballot, expecting it'll get mailed to them in time for them to fill it out and mail it back. It's just too tight a time frame. So we're trying to manage people's expectations too.
Right. And a follow-up question about drop boxes. Does the new legislation discuss whether drop boxes would have to be staffed versus whether unstaffed drop boxes are allowed?
Yeah, so I think that the legislation as currently conceived, the big disclaimer, right, that this is just proposals and it hasn't passed yet and hasn't been through the legislative process. But I think the concept is that they can be totally unstaffed drop boxes with some requirements that they be checked with some frequency by a staff person. I don't know exactly what we're going to wind up on. I think they've got to be emptied out at the end of every day. I think they're going to have to be locked up and secured at 7 o'clock on election day is what I've seen in the drafts that I've seen so far. So unlike mail ballots, which can get to a mailbox on election day and be postmarked, these drop boxes will be turned off by a staff person on election day. I know there's some concern from the registrars about funding to go with those additional staffing requirements, even if they're relatively minimal. It's a new job to be done on election day, and we're already having trouble, I know, in a lot of localities recruiting and training up and having election workers, again, given the people's concerns about being around a lot of people on election day. So we'll look at how we can handle that.
Right. And will the drop boxes be able to be activated during early voting as well?
Yes. I mean, it is to have the drop boxes going at really, I mean, the idea is wherever voting's taking place, you'll have a drop box option. So during the early voting, it'll be at the 16 satellites in Fairfax or wherever you guys set up satellite, I guess the community center in Falls Church or Dave Bierke's office.
Yeah, it's in the registrar's office at 300 Park Avenue.
Yeah, so he'll be able to put a drop box on his door or outside the building for people to drive by during early voting.
Okay, and back to the witness signature, does the legislation address the issue of what happens next year after the national emergency, or is it specific to this national emergency?
So this is, I'll be very honest with you guys. This is the difficulty with dropping the witness signature altogether. The question is, do you replace it with something, right? And there are a lot of states that don't have a witness requirement, but they have a signature match. But we found that in places like Georgia and Wisconsin, where they have a signature match requirement, when you have an administration that sees fraud behind every corner and danger lurking at every stop, they have a tendency to really exclude a lot of what you and I might look at and think we're matching signatures, but if they're imperfect matches, they get tossed. So I think that what we're struggling with is what is a good replacement. I don't think that there's a big appetite to, particularly right before an election, but it is what it is. I mean, to get rid of the requirement with nothing to replace it, because it does feed those narratives and undermines, rightly or not, and there's a big chunk of the electorate that's got concerns about fraud. You don't want to certainly feed those fears in a way that might undermine the results of the election. So we're struggling with that at the moment. But we need to figure out what, if anything, to do to replace it and for how long we want it to last. I think right now there's a comfort that people will sign some sort of an affidavit or make some sort of affirmation that they couldn't do it because of COVID under penalties of perjury and so forth, that's enough of a disincentive for fraud to cover us for this election. But we're still looking for the best way to go forward in perpetuity.
Okay. Will you talk to us about advocacy in this time of social distancing? What are techniques you've seen that are best practices for advocacy while we can't do one-on-one conversations, we can't do big group get-togethers? What are you seeing that's effective?
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, folks are going digital, right? And we've already seen a trend towards digital, but particularly for this election, I think there's a big movement towards taking money you might have spent on direct mail in the past and moving that towards a digital campaign for a couple of reasons. One, we expect election day to be an election kind of event, right? From October on to November, you're starting getting the second week of September, but the third week of September. But since election day is not a singular kind of moment in time, mail can come late. So I think digital advocacy, I think you're seeing a lot of people reaching folks where they are via text. A lot of campaigns are doing text campaigns. I do find that people are still sending me postcards and emails. But the door-to-door advocacy is really difficult to do too. So I think it's mostly a heavy kind of saturation in digital and hyper-targeted digital. And one of the things that campaigns are catching up with the private sector on, but I mean, it's amazing. Many of you all have ever searched for anything, right? So at the beginning of the summer for my 50th birthday, I got the Wave Runner, which the kids are out playing on right now. All of a sudden, I could get nothing but Facebook ads for ski tow ropes and water skis and tubes and trailer hitches and everything in the world, right? They know everything that I've bought and all my habits and what I might want to be involved with. So I think that the campaigns are starting to use that kind of data to do some really specifically targeted campaigns. And you guys have probably noticed that in some of your own feeds as well. The problem, of course, with the digital is that you know, the Chinese and the Russians, and this is, I don't mean to be glib about it, but they also have figured out how to use digital to influence people in campaigns as well. So we know that that's also going on.
Right, right. And what about for citizens to be talking to our legislators? What are best practices?
So advocating to us, so as opposed to like just voter outreach and influence.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can't come see me in my office the way you used to, right? I think for you guys to advocate during the special session, I think the phone call is probably the second best thing. Or some people, I've gotten some very well crafted personal emails where people add a couple things in the very first few sentences to make it really clear. Hey, this is so-and-so, and I'm writing you because I care about this for this reason, and no, this is not a form email, right? And I know it catches my eye when I see that. I also can recognize when I start seeing the exact same lines, over and over again in my preview window, that I'm getting a form email. And so I don't always, those get less attention. So I think if you could send a very personalized email and introduce yourself before you introduce your subject first, so that we see that it's personalized, I think that would be a great way to do some more effective advocacy. I think phone calls, Andrea is going to kill me for saying that because she hates dealing with the phone calls. But even if it goes to voicemail, the fact that you took the time to call, leave a voicemail, we hear your voice, we hear you talking, we know that you thought about what you were going to say. That's probably as close to an in-person visit as you're going to get. And I'm happy to schedule for groups like the League. I'm happy to schedule Zooms, even for groups as small as like 5 or 6, right? So when you might want to make an appointment to come with a group of 3 or 4 people to see me in my office, those are turning into the Zoom conversations with WebEx, Google Hangouts, Microsoft Teams, you name it, I've been doing them. So is that helpful?
That's very helpful, yes. Mm-hmm. Will you talk a little bit about how the budget issues are impacting affordable housing funding? The League is definitely interested in affordable housing and is doing some work on that issue. So wondering how all these budget issues are going to impact affordable housing.
So we've got $50 million in CARES Act money, to which the governor wants to add another $37 million, I think. So we want to get to about $87 million in funding for housing. Have some of that administered through the Housing Trust Fund. And some of it will be done directly for tenants. And mostly what it's being used for at the moment, the idea is that it's supposed to be used for eviction prevention. And that can come in a number of different forms. I'm hearing on the street, I'll be very honest with you all, it's a fairly big number. I know the $50 million program supposedly started already. I've heard from a lot of advocates that work on the ground with people in need of housing, that the money seems to be slow in making its way to tenants and landlords. I mean, my view of the overall issue, just to give you the 30,000-foot view, is you've got, the people hardest hit by COVID. I'm Zooming into work every day. I'm doing virtual closings and things like that. I know a lot of my constituents who work for the government are able to work remotely, but the people that work at Clarendon's Beach Shack, the people that work at Sweezy and 4Ps that wash dishes there, and bus tables and things, those folks have lost jobs that aren't coming back. And they are not going to have, and those are the folks that typically rent and rent apartments in large large, dense buildings. So coming up with ways to keep them housed is a win-win, I think, right? If we can get money to keep them there, the landlords continue to get some revenue from the units. The people that need housing continue to be housed where they are in the most efficient way possible. We're not, they're not homeless. They're not in need of even greater government services. So if we can find a way to get government funds to subsidize folks and keep them in their houses and put off eviction in a responsible way that doesn't just kick the can down the road. I hear some folks saying just cancel the rent. I think that's in some cases appropriate, but I think in some cases we need to come up with a way to make sure everybody's kept whole so that housing stock remains. We don't want landlords to just sell their housing unit, their rental units, and take them off the market. So it's really simple solutions can be a little bit elusive, but we're working on all of the above strategies for housing. And I think we need to pour more money into it. I think 87 million is insufficient. And so we're going to look for everything we can. I think that some people estimate the need in Virginia alone to be closer to 250 million, which is about 3 times what we have going towards it right now.
And how do you balance the short-term needs in terms of this crisis versus long-term needs in terms of giving more people opportunities to buy units, to buy homes so that they can build equity long-term?
Right, and that's the issue with the rainy day fund, right? How much do we spend that down now versus do we rob from, again, funds that are designed to put people in permanent housing and increase affordable housing stock versus just stopping the bleeding right this minute? It's easy for you and I to say in a Zoom to the family that's about to be evicted, they're like, you put all of it right into keeping me housed here. And so that's one of the difficult parts about governing and having to do it. But we're working hard to bring the resources we can to get that done.
Okay, we had a question about online voting. Is there any discussion or proposals for online voting, and are there opportunities to do online voting in a secure way?
Yeah, my dad asked me the same question the other day as I'm sitting on the floor of the house debating. Your parents will always have good advice for you, right? So he was like, why can't I just vote online? I can do all these secure banking transactions and everything. There ought to be a way that I ought to be able to submit my ballot securely online with blockchain or whatever, right? The problem with online voting is, and which distinguishes it from online banking. The great thing about online banking and blockchain and everything is there's an audit trail. We can follow every penny and every dollar back to where it came from. One of the things about voting is we want to keep it secret. Right? So balancing the secrecy of the ballot with the security that requires you to have an audit of every piece is what has eluded folks up until now. So I'm sure there's smarter people than me that can come up with some solutions for that. It's not anything that's being discussed, certainly for the current 2020 election. I do hear from folks every now and then that say we really need to broaden our imagination about that. And so I expect that there'll be some things coming that direction. And probably pilot programs and things that we'll have to experiment with before we get there. I think we're more likely to get to an all vote at home before we get there. So places like Oregon and Washington and Colorado have stopped really having election day. And everybody gets a ballot mailed to them. They fill it out and then they either mail it back or take it to a drop box. And I think that as depending on what happens in 2020, as people get more comfortable with that process, we may move in that direction first.
And we have a couple questions about how to stop gerrymandering. And certainly on the November 3rd ballot, we'll have a constitutional amendment where each of us get the opportunity to vote for a particular constitution amendment that was the product of 2 different sessions in the General Assembly. So coming to one law that got passed twice, and now it's going to be put to the voters on November 3rd. So that amendment would put citizens into the process for the first time, and have citizens be part of a commission that would also include legislators. So some audience members are interested in what your thoughts are on the constitutional amendment.
Sure. Well, and I rarely differ at all from my good friends in the league. And this is one of these issues where we're just not on the same page at the moment. So let me just I'm not going to argue with anybody about it, but I'll just sort of articulate my side of the argument for a moment. Which is you talk about citizens, and I know that one of your good friends and one of your members wrote an op-ed in the Falls Church News Press, which sort of shows the current line, which is at least to give citizens a seat at the table. So let's talk for just a minute about who those citizens are and how we pick them. Right? So the citizens are so the Democratic leadership, which would be folks like Eileen Fillercorn and Charnel Herring and Rip Sullivan and myself on Privileges and Elections and Joe Lindsay. We'll come up with a list of citizens that are acceptable to us. The Republicans, Todd Gilbert and Tommy Norman and Kirk Cox and his crew will come up with a list that are acceptable to them. We also create a list of circuit court judges who becomes the selection panel for the citizens that we submit to them. So the citizens are picked by legislators, and then that list is culled by judges who legislators have previously elected, who are now retired circuit court judges. So my point being in all that certainly they're not legislators, but they're not exactly likely to be, your run-of-the-mill average citizen or Joe off the street. And one of the ways that I think that, I'll just whine a little bit for a second, but I think Democrats are often held to a different standard than Republicans. I suspect that people will come to me and Eileen and others as Democratic leaders and say, we need to appoint someone from Common Cause, and we need to appoint somebody from the League of Women Voters, and we need to appoint somebody from the ACLU and the American Association of University Women. Those should be the citizens that Democrats will be expected to appoint. I think Republicans are going to appoint citizens who are their political consultants and their mail firms and the Ed Gillespie's and the Project Red Map folks of the world. And that's just sort of how they do business. And of course, their electorate is fine with them putting those folks on these commissions. So just something to keep in mind as far as who the citizens are. The other part of it is it doesn't, the language of the amendment doesn't prevent gerrymandering. It only really protects political minorities. It doesn't protect minority communities. We have legislation that will do that. So at any rate, I hope that folks will reject this amendment. It's got a lot of flaws in it and get me to, oh, by the way, then the other part of it is it's got 8 legislative members to go with the 8 of their friends that they picked to be the citizen members to make the commission. And then any 2 legislators of the same caucus can veto the map and send it to the Supreme Court. So I'm proposing, and I proposed during the session, that now that the Democrats are in control of both chambers in the governor's mansion, let us propose an all-citizens commission that's made up entirely of citizens that are picked from a broad spectrum of Virginians. We'll have criteria for picking them that make sure they're not just friends of legislators. And then let's do a purer form of the commission for 2021, and then build that into the Constitution in 2022 or 23 or 24, whenever the next opportunity is. So that's my
yeah, I mean, a few follow-ups on that. I mean, first, I think it is the fact that the constitutional amendment does have language to protect minority communities. I mean, it actually is in the text of the constitutional amendment. So maybe, are you saying that in practice, that text won't, talk about why you have concerns that text won't work in practice?
So that text, the text of that language says that it'll comply with the Voting Rights Act as interpreted by the Supreme Court. The problem is the Supreme Court lately has gutted the Voting Rights Act. We no longer have pre-clearance, for instance. The Voting Rights Act is under attack by the Trump administration and the court. So I don't know that we can always rely on the Voting Rights Act to be a bulwark and provide those protections to communities of color. It says that, and it's not just me saying that. I mean, this is what I'm hearing and gathering from people like Marcia Price and LaSharice Aird and Lamont Bagby, who's the chair of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. So I know that the 2021 says there's language in there. I think, again, it's a reference sort of to compliance with the the Voting Rights Act. I don't think that that's as strong a language as we would like to see in there to prevent gerrymandering based on race and prevent. I mean, my language would have had specific prohibitions against packing and against dilution in our text. In other words, we don't have to interpret somebody else's act for the protection. In the language we would propose, you say you can't dilute their votes and you can't pack them into small districts to prevent them from having broader representation.
Yeah, and I mean, this is not a forum specific to gerrymandering, so we're not going to be, responding to every point where the League of Women Voters position is on the record, and that is that we urge people to vote yes. But just a couple of questions to, hear about some of the specifics. You mentioned concern about who'd be appointing the citizens, and that the Republicans may appoint partisan people, people with very partisan backgrounds. Still, there's going to be a requirement for before maps are adopted that there's a supermajority on that commission. So you wouldn't be able to get maps finalized by the commission with just the Republican legislatures and just the citizens who are essentially appointed by the Republican legislatures. Does that give you any, does that give us any more hope for an actual independent judgment about the maps?
So, I mean, again, without disparaging any of my good friends, I've been on a number of committees, a number of panels, and you have experts, and they sometimes will have outside. All of us who have sat on a committee, there's certain folks that have a little more subject matter expertise. Republicans at ALEC conduct seminars on how to gerrymander without making it look like gerrymandering. I mean, they're professionals at this. They really are. So to A. B, I think the supermajority requirement, I think it's a little Pollyannish to think that it's going to require compromise. So here's the problem. The other problem I got, I hate to make this one too loudly the way that my friend Mark Levine does, but in any negotiation, generally the parties want the same thing. So I do real estate negotiations for a living. I help people come to settlement on a house. And sometimes something's wrong. The house isn't in the condition everybody expected it to be. And there's a fight over who's responsible for fixing it. The good news is those almost always work out because the seller wants to sell the house. The buyer wants the house. They know roughly what they expect it's worth. They may have slight differences of opinion, but they all want the same thing. Once you start negotiating these maps and you require a supermajority to get them drawn, the incentive to come to an agreement is much stronger for Democrats, because if there is no agreement and they can't get to the supermajority, then the map making process gets kicked over to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is composed of, I think, 6 out of the 9, I don't know, the supermajority, let's put it that way. The supermajority of the Supreme Court members, I don't have my notes with me on this, but so I don't want to get the numbers wrong. But a supermajority of Supreme Court members were appointed and elected by Republicans and elected by Republican legislatures. So if it doesn't work out for Republicans on the commission, no big deal. We'll trust our friends on the Supreme Court to take care of it. If it doesn't work out for the Democrats, I think there's a greater risk of an outcome that we're not happy with. And so I don't think it's going to be a difficult position for them to be in. Again, I wish that I could be more sanguine about that, but I've been in a lot of legislative negotiations. We tried to, so it's like I said, I'm not. I wish, hopefully I'm wrong, because I have a feeling that although I'm advocating as loudly as I can for the no position, that's not going to be one that prevails. So I hope that I'm wrong about these things, but that's where my concern comes about that.
One thing that has happened in the last couple of years is California had an independent redistricting commission that was made up of all citizens. And yet once the independent commission came up with the plan and it went through, there were multiple lawsuits filed. So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court there in California actually decided on the maps at the end of the day anyway. So even though they had a different structure and one that might look better on paper, it was still the California Supreme Court that actually decided it.
Yeah, and ultimately, look, given the state of society we live in, the idea that this won't be litigated at some point, the courts will have a role to play in a lot of this. And that's just sort of where we are, I think. That being said, I think that there's a better way to get there and give the courts a better map to work off of than what they would get from this constitutional amendments process.
And we had a question about if the constitutional amendment doesn't pass and then it goes, back to the legislature to figure out how to do this for 2021. What are the timing implications of that? Would it be possible even to get something passed before the maps need to be started to be redrawn?
Yeah. So regardless of what happens, we're going to have a special session probably in November to get the process started, because we don't have the enabling legislation that would actually make appoint the commission and get the commission process started under the amendment did not pass during the regular session. So we don't have enabling legislation. So there are certain, a lot of times the constitutional amendments, the Constitution in various places will say the General Assembly shall by general law do this, this, and this, right? And so some of the functions to stand up the program require the General Assembly to do things, provide laws about how things will get done. Those laws haven't passed yet. So we're going to have to do that regardless. So to help avoid that, Delegate Price and I proposed a enabling bill at the end of our session, at the beginning of March, the end of the 2020 session, that had an if it passes A, if it fails B, right? So we had a plan B, and our plan B would have said, plan A would have been actually to pre-appoint the citizen commissioners and so they could get started working, and they could start doing public hearings and soliciting input and doing all those things. And then if the constitutional amendment failed for some reason in November, they would be replaced by the legislators on the committee would be replaced by 8 more citizens. So we had there's a plan A and a plan B that exists and have been drafted. The Senate didn't want to adopt that bill back in March because they were afraid if we actually had plan A and plan B out there in the public domain, that it would make plan B look too attractive. So they thought the best chances of getting the amendment to pass were not to have plan B out there. But there is in fact a plan A and a plan B. Both of them will have, one or the other will now have to be passed after we know the results of the election in November.
Yeah, it's going to be a tight time frame no matter what. So.
Yep. Well, then the good news, bad news is that I don't have a lot of confidence that the Census Bureau is going to get us our census data on time. So we'll have some time while we're waiting for our census data to arrive to take care of some of the administrative pieces. I suspect, they've not granted any extension for completing the census, which means unfortunately we'll suffer with probably incomplete and poor data. But on the other hand, I think that our one worst case scenario, which is we didn't have any data at all to draw the districts in time for the 2021 election, probably won't come to pass. It's historically, we've ended up having to delay the primaries until September from June to give us time to draw maps and get them and then litigate them over the summer. So again, this idea of litigating them is right, nothing new there. So I suspect that that's what will happen. We'll push the elections back, the primaries into September, and there'll be a shorter absentee period for everything so that we can get this done.
Yeah, and the census is, of course, a huge issue this year, and Falls Church City has an easier time since we're small, and so we're, pretty good on response rates. How's it looking across Virginia, and do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, the response rates are not great everywhere, and particularly in some of the places, so our very dense urban areas where people are suspicious of giving out information. Have not had great experiences with the government, whether it be the criminal justice system or otherwise, where usually you've had community organizers go in and you've had members from those communities have to go door to door to collect census data. That doesn't seem to be happening as well, mostly because of COVID. And then out in rural areas, you also have a problem just because some folks are hard to reach and suspicious of the government for different reasons. So, I'm not, our response rate is lower than it's been in years past at this point in time. And I know that we're working hard to try and overcome that, but the quarantine, I think, has not helped with that. And I then also think people are operating under the hopeful assumption that they'd have more time, which is not turning out to pass. So now it's a real kind of a race to gather as much data as we can. So I think places like Fairfax and Falls Church are probably in pretty good shape. But I think places like Hampton Roads, Richmond City, and then some more rural areas are probably behind where they've been in years past, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we have just a few more minutes. Does anyone in the audience have another question, or maybe we can end by going back again to the special session, since that's what's going on right now. In terms of some of the police reform items that you laid out, which ones do you think have the best chance of passing? Which ones are getting the most, the most debate? What do you see happening in that area?
My bill's certainly going to pass. No, but I do actually have one of the easier ones, right? This idea of decertification is the Republicans, I think, in their press release said, well, we should do, there are some reforms we can take, like, for instance, making it easier to decertify police officers. So that one seems to be a pretty easygoing one. The more difficult ones are going to deal with, so this is the challenge. Going forward, there's a little more consensus about changing practices from this point forward. The more difficult piece is dealing with issues to correct problems that happened in the past. And so my good friend Don Scott, who's a defense attorney, new member of the House of Delegates, African-American from Portsmouth, who's representing Louise Lucas, and saying, you guys can't fix this problem without addressing all these people that are in jail who were stopped on pretextual stops before, or who were given, were coerced into signing confessions because they were given no good options. They had to take a plea bargain because of these mandatory minimums that made it just a smart business, frankly, to plead guilty to something they didn't do because it was so much work. How can we fix the problem going forward without backward and addressing some of the people that are incarcerated under the old system? The Republicans love that because I'm being partisan, I'm sorry, but if you do that, we will basically Willie Horton you all to death. We will do mail pieces and flyers about all the awful things that all these people that you want to let out of jail have done. People that you're going to grant parole to or early release, or make it even possible for them to get a release and never get out of jail. The political difficulty with that and the demagoguery that goes around that is making it difficult for us to some of those issues. So that is the challenge. So things, reform and police practices going forward going to be a little bit easier. There are some things, I think the sovereign immunity probably won't get done during the special session because it's a fairly complicated issue and it has big fiscal impacts for localities who have to pay for the insurance to pay for these suits. But I think that a lot of the banning chokeholds, the police practices themselves, the pretextual stops, decertification of police, better screening and recruitment, things moving forward probably have a pretty good chance of passing. And you're going to see a big knockdown drag out over things like reestablishing parole and revisiting sentences, getting rid of mandatory minimums for people that have already been in jail. That's where you're going to see the big fight. And I can't predict the outcome of that.
Yeah, big issues to consider. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions in chat, and we really appreciate your time, and this has been such a great conversation. I also want to thank two of our city council members who have joined today. So Phil Duncan and Letty Hardy have both joined to be part of this conversation, so thank you to them.
Thank you, Alice.
Yeah, and a big thank you to Delegate Simon for providing us a real chance for information and some back and forth, and a great chance to keep up on everything that's happening. So,
and as much as I've enjoyed talking to you guys from long, my kids are bugging me to come back, get back out. I do look forward to being able to see you all in person and see your faces and see the looks on your faces as I'm talking. That's what I lose here. I don't know if you guys are buying what I'm selling or not, but also just to see you all again and be in the same room. So hopefully we'll all be back together physically soon and be able to do this in person and a lot more. So thank you guys very much for having me.
That's definitely true. And yeah, enjoy the rest of
Minecraft.
Nice day, and yeah, have a good rest of your weekend. And I know you're going to be really busy this week with the session. So.
Yep. All right. Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.